Hello everyone! For this video, as Hasbro Beyblade X has its Wave 1 completed for now, let us do a tier list with everything currently in Hasbro's Beyblade X Wave 1. Now I do want to do a shout out to the boy Kyo for any help and advice on the placement, wording, or any things of that matter, as well Fable from the WBO for any advice, so shout outs to them for all the help. Now of course we have the ground rules for this tier list video, so please take the moment to just pause and just read over it. I don't want to have so long of this video just explaining the ground rules, so have fun. So to go over to your part by part, your blade is the main thing that makes direct contact with your opponent, primarily having metal contact. Your ratchets determine the height of the Beyblade, the balance of the center of gravity, and the impact position of the blade. Ratchets are basically what triggers the burst on a Beyblade X Beyblade by turning on impact. Bits are what touch the stadium floor and determine what type your Beyblade is, as well as the movement pattern, your extreme dash performance, and your burst resistance. Some bits can have different gear ratios, some bits can have different levels of resistance, so keep all this in mind as we get into it. Lastly, with the Beyblade X generation, every single bay has the ability to do the extreme dash. This ability refers to when a Beyblade X bay uses the extreme accelerator rail and builds up massive speed and power to strike against its opponent. Starting us off, F is basically the God help us tier. This is where I think it's so hard to make it be usable for anything that there is no point to trying to use it. And for that, we have Tusk Mammoth. Now, I already know the Tusk Mammoth people are going to be typing in the comments saying, listen here, you son of a bitch, Tusk Mammoth, I could win with it. And now listen. You can win with something that's an absolute piece of dog shit. It's possible to win with almost anything in Beyblade. However, here are my reasoning for why I absolutely hate Tusk Mammoth. Despite the fact I think the color choice is really awesome, the motif looks really cool, and overall is a pretty cool design. They gave it an imbalance on the blade, which that's basically this triangular part that's on Helm Knight. Now, it makes sense why this is on Helm Knight, because this is a defense type that has a very rounded off shape. You don't want to have it be as much stamina as Arrow Wizard, so they put an imbalance for the design. Okay, that can make some sense on a case-by-case basis. For this to be on Tusk Mammoth, that's a big fuck up, because this is a balanced type blade that is more or less the same thing as Scythe Incendio, which, by the way, every single Hasbro new motif, right, the little exclusives, if you will, in air quotes, they're basically retooled of the original Takara Tomy versions of those bays. To basically have it where it's light, imbalance, they remove the aggressive contact points, which mind you is the whole thing that makes Scythe Incendio so good, because of the fact if it's aggressive, it can bully stamina types with its aggressive shape, and it can fight against attackers because of the aggressive shape while still maintaining stamina due to the round shape. Now imagine if you took everything good out of Scythe Incendio and you shoved it into Tusk Mammoth, and that's Tusk Mammoth. It's an absolute joke of a blade. So that's why we're in the F tier, and that is why I'm very heated. Now, mind you, if you are still trying to run Tusk Mammoth on viable combinations, because its shape's not really that aggressive, the most I could maybe say is potentially stamina. But I suppose if the stamina is absolutely terrible on it, you could try to run this maybe on a 60 taper instead of a 60 ball. So anything that's a 60 height on either ball or taper could maybe be your best bet for Tusk Mammoth, I guess. Now we get to the D tier, which is just the lot of work section. So this basically means that it takes a lot of work. So in this, we're going to be starting off with Talon Terra. So Talon Terra is a retooling of Tail Viper. Talon Terra is, by the way, best used on any 60 height, on really just low flat. On anything else, I don't really like it, but that's just my opinion. Now, some of the pros, I'll say that it's decent for smacking base for attack. Despite being a stamina type, it's got an aggressive shape. You primarily are just going to be using this on attack combinations. Now, it's good in an attack versus an attack matchup, so that means anything that has an attack bit or a balance bit, basically. Now, the cons are, they basically rounded off a lot of the contacts and made it more exposed. Now, Tail Viper, it hangs pretty low, but for Talon, it's not as low, and the gap issue on Tail Viper is really big here, causing a super big burst risk. So you have it where it's kind of shitty attack, and then after you have it where the gap is not doing it any favors, and it leaves it exposed from the ratchet to get hit and lose by burst. Now next up, we have Dronzer S, which this is the crossover bay. You'd want to be running Dronzer S on any like 60 height, on like a low flat, a regular flat, I guess. Now, the pros are, when it can hit, pretty decent hits, and primarily only good in an attack versus an attack matchup. So that means anybody that has an attack bit or balance bit. Now, the cons are that Dronzer S is incredibly light. So it basically gets weight crept by majority of the stuff in Beyblade X, while even in a Hasbro Beyblade X stadium, you can maybe bullshit some wins because the meta is not the same as the Kiritomi Stadium. It's still so hard to use. Moving on from there, we have Spike. Spike is a bit that you can just view as meh. I just don't find it that consistent. I think the pros are that it can move around the stadium quite a bit, which is nice, but I also think the cons are it doesn't have that much stamina compared to Needle or High Needle, and I don't feel it has that good of KO resistance. Alrighty, next up we have this C tier, which is the Sum Work section. So this is where you don't gotta try as hard to try to win with this stuff, or it's not that much of a struggle for skill use just to get it to win anything. Now, starting us off, we have the lovely Steel Samurai, where this is a retooling of Claw Leon. Steel Samurai is primarily going to be just used on either balance combinations, so a 60 taper, or you could try to run it on a tall height, like an 80 height, primarily 580 on, let's say, flat. Now, the reason why this works is you're trying to use the contacts to align with the 580 to try to smash into opponents and maybe try to win. Now, Steel Samurai is dog shit against anything stamina type defense. If you try to use this on any... Okay, Steel Samurai, it's bad on stamina and defense because of the weight, the shape, the weight distribution, and the fact that it's a little bit hollowed inside. Now, you're going to be really just using this in an attack versus an attack matchup, so it does pretty decent, but the issue also with saying this is that while I think the contact points on it are okay, and it can maybe do okay enough, the issue is because of how these exclusives are handled, they feel kind of weirdly hollowed, I guess, and it kind of gets ragdolled around. It's not the most consistent, but it's at least serviceable. Like, it's like okay. Like, next up we have Knife Shinobi. This is a retooling of Horn Rhino, so we basically kind of get to kill two birds with one stone in this, because whatever is bad on this one is good for Horn Rhino. So the one thing that this is best used for, by the way, is mainly on attack combinations on a 60 height, so a low flat or a flat, or a 60 height on, let's say, High Needle. Now, the pros are this has slightly better defense than Horn Rhino because of the more rounded off shape. Now the cons, which this also does extend a little bit to Horn Rhino, for defense, it can burst very quickly due to the small condensed shape and the insufficient weight, which basically makes it have a recoil release. Now what that basically means is that when the bay is hitting it really hard, because of how the blade design is, the impact of it forces it to have the bit pop out pretty easily. Few blades suffer from this, meaning they can't be used for the specific types they were intended for. This is a similar case to here. On the lower tier stuff, maybe you can get away with defense, but you're just gonna use this for attack. The exposed ratchet also makes it kind of easy to burst. And while it can be used for attack combinations and do okay, it does hit a lot worse than Horn Rhino because of the more rounded off shape, so it's just a shittier version of Horn Rhino. Speaking of which, Horn Rhino, all the negatives are the exact same as Knife Shinobi. It can just be used pretty good for attack stuff on a 60 height, low flat, or regular flat. It runs out of steam pretty quickly for attack. It doesn't really have much stamina. It's not really the best for defense, and yeah. Next up, whoa, Tail Viper, best used on a 60 height. Primarily, you could do this on a rush bit or maybe a taper. I prefer this just low flat or maybe sometimes flat. So the pros are, and keep in mind, this was intended for obviously stamina, but because of the aggressive shape, you really just use this for attack, which is a trend you'll see with some blades in Beyblade X that they don't really do as the intended typing. Now, it's pretty decent for attack stuff. It can do some pretty good deflection hits because of the weird shape, and can do okay against generally stamina stuff, but is primarily only really good against an attack versus an attack matchup, so any bays that have attack bits or balance bits. Now, the cons, or two two things. One, I think the gap of it is pretty annoying on it. It is easy to abuse it and then after just cause it to get destabilized or potentially burst it. But most importantly, because of the gap, it can be very inconsistent to deliver hits and blows. While you can definitely argue that when it does hit, it does good, consistently, I think it's ass. So I might be a hater. I already know the all the Toguro fans are gonna kill me, but okay, now next up is Needle. Okay, so the thing is this. Needle is decent, it's solid, but the issue is the skill use required to use Needle is really high. So it's a decent defense bit, right? It can take some very large impactful hits. The stamina on it is okay. You generally want to try to tilt and try to, strong shoot it. Now, the thing is because of how small the stadium is, where you can launch and how much space you have is also a huge factor. I just think it does okay. I think it definitely requires a little bit of skill use. You can get away with using Needle still, I want to say, at least in wave 1, until we get more bits that maybe can be a little bit more consistent, but I'll say it's okay. Now we get to the B section, the good section. All right, this is where we start moving up, where there's like decent use, very practical for a lot of stuff. And so starting us off in the B tier, we have Arrow Wizard. So this is primarily going to be used on 60 height, preferred 560 on orb or ball, or even on taper, if you want to have it go up against attackers while still maintaining some decent stamina, or in general, just maintaining decent stamina while attacking. Now, you could be also running Arrow Wizard on an 80 height, but that'd mostly be for stamina combinations if you would prefer, specifically 380 or 580. Now, the pros are it has the best raw stamina in Beyblade X. What does raw stamina mean? Just the best overall stamina compared to other stuff, because obviously some blades can have certain, kind of hacks abilities that can kind of negate, let's say, the stamina on a bay or something, causing it to destabilize and lose maybe, but I also think once the contact points are worn, it does have pretty decent defense. Now, the cons on Arrow Wizard, I would just say, are the gap. The gap on the blade is pretty easy. Now, obviously, this is like a typing thing for, I guess, defense and stamina that they give them, gaps generally. It's usually almost always a negative. Sometimes bays can get away with surviving, and sometimes not even just defense and stamina, sometimes even balance bays, but it only depends on just if they're able to have the pros outweigh the cons. In this case, I think it's decent enough. Okay, now, next up, we have a Mint Sword Drawn. Now, what do I mean by this? So this is primarily used on attack combinations on a 60 height, on a low flat, taper, high taper, rush, whatever you may see fit for an attack bit. Now, the pros are a Mint Sword Drawn, one of the heaviest hitting attackers in Beyblade X, other than maybe, your Shark or your Phoenix. Mint condition, shit hits like crazy hard. Sword Drawn obviously has in its design upper blades. Now, that's supposed to lift the opponents up in the air and get the extreme finish. You can sometimes generally do that, but primarily something like Sword Drawn is mostly on smash attack. Now, the cons are it's top heavy because all the weight is pushed upwards. That means it's going to have a little bit of low stamina for the end game. Its stamina is not the best. And while you're going to say, oh, but it's an attack type. Yeah, you can have attack types and they can have decent enough stamina, relax. It also has what I like to dub the term negative recoil. So you know how in Pokemon, when you do a Volt Tackle and you get recoil from doing that move? Okay, so imagine that for attack types in Beyblade, where sometimes an attacker will just hit some shit so hard that the force will end up just being used against itself. Now, Sword Drawn, but worn. So basically, it has these triangular explosive contact points, which leads it to being so powerful, but those wear pretty easily over time. So basically, the only difference is you can still run this for attack stuff, but a little bit less explosive compared to Mint condition. Now, because of this rounder off shape, you could be running this on an 80 or 60 height on either needle, high needle, ball, or orb. It's just one of the cool things that it can do. Now, speaking of bits, we have high taper. Now, high taper is 1 millimeter taller than regular taper. It's very, very similar shape to regular taper. I want to say slightly worse stamina due to the higher center of gravity. It's more or less the same practical use, having more control than that of regular flat and greater stamina, but slightly less attack power. If you want to use this over taper, your benefit would maybe be just hitting a little bit above to the opponents, which sometimes can matter in Beyblade X, depending on what blade you use. I think it's decent. Now we have low flat. Now we're going shorter. So it basically has the indent on the bottom of it removed, but what's more important is that it has a lower center of gravity. I do feel generally because it's closer to the ground, it's able to kind of move a little bit better and faster than that of a regular flat. Also because you're on a lower height, you're able to target the ratchets more, which is a big thing for attackers, so that's a very nice benefit. Overall, it's just a very consistent attack bit. Next up, we have high needle. Now we are going taller, 1mm taller than that of regular needle, and the big difference here is in the shape actually. So this is where it actually matters for the difference, because needle is a very sharp cone and this is more of a pushed out wider cone, so it has greater stamina than that of regular needle and it's taller. So your benefit is that you can probably have better endgame stamina. Maybe you won't take as explosive hits, but stamina is still pretty good. And because you're taller, it's gonna be harder for your opponent to hit you, so that's the positive. Next up, we have the A tier. Now, the A tier, this is the shit that just gets you with a smile on the face. The great! Starting us off, we have Chain Incendio. Now, this is best on a 60 height, on taper, ball, or orb, at least right now for wave 1. Obviously, once more waves come out, I might do updates on any blades for any more viable parts generally, but what's really good about this design is that it has strong deflection and attack properties. So this works for defense when opponents are trying to hit you and trying to KO you out. You have a very good shape that can actually counter opponents and fight back. So a mix of stamina and attack. It's good for attack because it can deflect against opponents and can mess up a lot of top tier stuff and do pretty well. I just feel it's kind of okay for what the bar is. Like, it's not so exceptionally strong where it's at the top, but it deserves its flowers for how good it is. It's highly versatile. The only negative you could maybe throw in this is maybe the gap, but that rarely ever gets like any real effect in battle. Now this is where y'all might hate me for this, but I like Dagger Drawn. Dagger Drawn is best on a 60 height, primarily 516 honestly on rush, but if you wanted to run it on a taper, that could be fine. And then after the other ones, I don't like it as much, but flat or low flat can work, but they're not as effective. So what are the pros to Dagger Drawn? So Dagger has good stamina as an attacker and good deflection properties. Now, they claim for this blade to basically have barrage attack. The barrage attack is just a shittier version of smash attack, which smash attack is just basically the force to KO a bay forward. And you know, sometimes these abilities can kind of do stuff interesting, like, you know, with Dagger Drawn, its barrage attack is mostly just a shitty version of smash attack. So this is the thing. Against other attackers, it does pretty good. Against stamina types and that type of shit is where it kind of gets a little bit tricky because its hits aren't as strong as you would want them to be. You quite literally want it to do those repeated hits, but I feel it's pretty good. Now, if you wanted to argue lower, we could maybe have that discussion, but not today, not today. Next up is Keel Shark. I love this one. This is great on 60 height, on a flat, taper, rush, or low flat. Now, Shark has great smash attack, which is the force to KO a bay forward, so that would be like your knockout zone, but because of the curves in the shape, it helps you get that extreme finish because it lifts opponents up in the air due to the slope in the design. Not only that, but Shark has a pretty sharp part on the top of the blade, which is very good for sniping ratchets. It's super, super hard, super explosive hits compared to anything in Wave 1, honestly. Yes, even Sword Phoenix, and its negatives are the stamina on it. It's honestly the same issue as Sword Drawn for cons, but even more. Stamina's pretty bad, and the negative recoil can kind of go crazy. This is kind of like a nuke blade. Now, next up, we have Helm Knight. Now, this Helm Knight, pretty good defense blade while still maintaining decent stamina. So first of all, this whole thing is like, it's supposed to have like this shock absorption. I don't believe in that shit. It definitely can take hits, that's one thing for sure. Now, it's good on a 60 height or an 80 height on, now 60 height is specifically ball orb, but 80 height ball orb, needle, or high needle. Now, it has pretty decent stamina, despite the fact they put an imbalance on the design, which the only other bays that have that are Tusk Mammoth, which I fucking hate, Drawn's Arrest, which is also pretty ass, they did that, but Hell Knight, like, you know, that's a game balancing where at least it makes sense there. Now, despite the imbalance, as long as you try to balance tune it, which balance tuning basically means I am reassembling the ratchet in a different orientation, and whatever offers me greater stamina and more stability is going to be better. Now, it can take some pretty big hits due to the wavy design. It's going to pop out of the pocket and come back. It can take pretty good hits. You have to make sure you do a good tilt on the angle. You're not trying to launch it flat, but I think it's pretty decent defense. Now, the only other cons you can maybe say are the gap on the blade and maybe the imbalance if you don't balance tune it. Orb. Now, Orb, I think, is very comparable to that to ball. It's just a tinier ball. It's more or less similar stamina, not quite the exact same, but you can get pretty similar performance if you launch hard, but this had decent KO defense. Now, flat is just a regular solid attack bit, not really much else to say there. It's just solid for attack. Okay, and this is where it's gonna get really controversial because gear flat. Now hold on, let me cook. I'll explain why gear flat is this high up, even though on a TT ranking, this shit would be a lot lower. This is the Takara Stadium. Okay, now first of all, low flat, I kind of put it a little bit lower because one, the stamina and the control is a lot harder than that of, I would say, regular flat generally, but low flat is still pretty good. It's just the skill use required. Flat is just a basic attack. Now gear flat, here's the thing. Gear flat is the purest form of attack. Now, when you're in a stadium where there is a greater bias, whether you want to accept this or not, than the Takara Tomy Stadium, because Takara Tomy Stadium, it's wider, there's more space, more things can travel around, more things can survive. A Hasbro Stadium is a lot smaller, which means if you're aggressive, you're probably gonna have a decent time on KOing opponents. Now, imagine that, but now you have a bit that can take advantage of that, where in a TT Stadium, you have a wide space of an area, you can mess up many, many times, and while there's still the big self-KO risk, which gear flat definitely does have, because of this space, I feel you can honestly kind of bullshit a lot of wins in this stadium. And I feel that's one of the big differences in the rankings for this. Now, again, controversial, I know, but I will stick to this until Wave 2 tier, unless I change my mind. Now, S tier, this is where the greats of the greats, the bays that rest on here are some of the best bays, either by power level or ease of skill to use. Scythe Incendio is good on, let's say, on a 60 height, on ball or needle or high needle. Now here's the thing, it's a round shape, which is already good for stamina, and it's aggressive on the upper little attack blades that it has there. So you have it where it has good stamina, meaning it can bully attackers and attack it with its aggressive shape using its bullshit hacks ability, and it can take big hits from attackers because of the aggressive shape while still having good stamina. So it's a pretty good balance type. It has a good mix of both of these properties, even though it's primarily just used on stamina stuff. It gets the job done. Now, taper. Ooh, why is taper here and above that of flat? Okay, well, hear me out on this. Because of the fact that the Hasbro Stadium is smaller and you primarily want a lot of control and you don't want to have to risk a lot of like thought and all that stuff, taper is obviously slower than that of regular flat and it has good stamina. I feel taper here is kind of, it should make sense to be a little bit higher in that regard. It's greater stamina than regular flat and it's technically less attack power, but there's more control, which is a big thing that I think matters in this stadium. Now, there could be a case where control can't matter, or maybe a case where it can, and this is the case where I think it can. Ball is just basically, it's just a good stamina bit. It just gets the job done. It's good for stamina. It's okay defense, whatever. It's ball. Yeah, I don't really want to elaborate any further. Now, Rush. Now, Rush has 10 gears instead of 12. Please ignore the typo in any previous video that I've ever had. What's really good about this is that, one, it's slow and controlled, and it can do a repeated extreme dash. So as I've been mentioning countless times, because of that reason, you have it where the stadium that requires a lot of control, and you don't want to waste so much of your power, Rush does the job perfectly in the stadium. It's honestly the best attack bit to use in Beyblade X right now. Now, as we get to the finale, we have Soar Phoenix. As we soar on to the SS tier, where this is a bro. This shit's crazy. Okay, now Soar Phoenix, first of all, this is fucking crazy that they put Soar Phoenix in the Wave 1 release. Now, Soar Phoenix is really best on anything. A defense, stamina, balance, attack, it can do it. It is hard carried by the fact it is the heaviest blade currently out in Hasbro Beyblade X Wave 1 right now. So it weight creeps basically everything. Now, that doesn't mean it's invincible. There are definitely things that can counter and beat it. It's just very easy to spam and use because it's highly versatile and the weight carries it. The shape of it's not even that good. If the shape of the, if the weight of this was like terrible and the shape was already kind of ass, it probably wouldn't be that sped. But the weight carries it like crazy. Do you want to use it on stamina combinations? Well, you can, because if it's heavyweight and aggressive shape, you can use some bullshit hacks to bully other stamina types. You want to have it on a stamina combination or defense? Well, guess what? Your heavyweight can be used for great defense against attackers. You want to beat up other attackers or stamina types? Well, guess what? You've got a heavyweight and it's going to bully the shit out of them. So most preferred would be on the 60 height on rush, then maybe taper, then flat, then low flat, or defense on 60 height, high needle, or 60 height for stamina, ball, or orb. So someone may ask, what about ratchets, by the way? So basically, I'll give you a TLDR. If it's between a 60 and an 80 height, it's on a case-by-case basis. Generally, for most things, you want to run a 60 height. Now, for 80, the preference could just be specifically for stamina/defense combinations, but again, on a case-by-case basis, and as well for the sides, which side is the best. Now, I'll say that 960 is really good because it's well rounded off for its shape and design. 560 is pretty thick and it has some great outwards weight distribution. 360 is well rounded off, so on a case-by-case basis, you see whichever makes the most sense to use between that stuff. The worst one that is shit, however, is 4 sides. Other than it being pretty light, it's also the easiest to burst out of all the sides, so that's the only time when I'm going to say, maybe not this. 4 sides maybe could have some use, but honestly, with the options you have right now, as we start to wrap up, overall, I gotta say this was really fun to do. I love doing tier list videos because that means I just get to sit here for 1 hour and just edit so much fucking B-roll and just have a blast. Now, I do want to mention something. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel and comment your thoughts. Not only that, but hey, do you want to get Takeratomi Beyblade X products? Well, my friend, mallofbays.com. We have Beyblade X products, the previous generation of Beyblade Burst products. It is an optional way to support the channel. I appreciate any and all support regardless. And as well, if you're trying to get Hasbro Beyblade X products, I have affiliate Amazon links in the description. Now listen, I get a little bit of commission if you use these links, so it'd be greatly appreciated. But yeah, aside from that, I just want to say thank you all for watching. Hope to do more videos of this in the future. And I want to say thank you all for watching. That'll be it for now. Take care and bye.